The most dangerous moral decisions are not the ones that are obviously wrong. They are the ones that seem unquestionably right. That sounds backwards. We like to believe that doing the right thing brings clarity. That morality points us toward a cleaner path, a better outcome, a world with less suffering. But what if some of history's most admired acts of conscience came with a hidden cost? What if the people we celebrate for their courage were also forced to carry a burden that few of us would ever willingly accept? That is the mystery at the heart of Antigone. Not the mystery of whether she was brave. Most people agree that she was. Not even the question of whether she was justified. Entire generations have debated that for centuries. The deeper question is far more uncomfortable. What happens when duty demands a sacrifice before it offers any proof that the sacrifice will matter? Think about that for a moment. Most people are willing to support a principle after it succeeds. They celebrate the whistleblower after the truth is revealed. They admire the reformer after society changes. They praise the person who stood alone once history has already decided who was right. But standing alone before the outcome is known, that is something very different. And this is where Antigone stops being a literary figure and becomes something much larger. She becomes a symbol of a burden. A burden that appears whenever an individual feels responsible for something that everyone else has chosen to ignore. Imagine a city looking away from a problem because acknowledging it would be inconvenient. Imagine an institution protecting stability instead of confronting an uncomfortable truth. Imagine a family remaining silent because speaking up would come at a cost. Then imagine one person refusing that silence. At first glance, that sounds heroic. But here is the contradiction. The moment someone accepts that responsibility, they also inherit consequences they cannot control. That is the part we rarely talk about. Duty is often described as a source of strength. Yet duty can also become a source of isolation. The very principle that gives a person purpose may separate them from the people they care about. The conviction that makes them admirable may also make them dangerous to the existing order. And suddenly the question changes. The issue is no longer whether a principle is noble. The issue becomes whether you are willing to live with everything that principle might unleash. This is why one image continues to echo through the story of Antigone long after the details fade. An unburied body. Not because of what it represents politically, but because of what it represents psychologically. A debt. An obligation. A responsibility that nobody wants to carry. That image survives because it points toward something universal. Every generation creates its own version of that abandoned responsibility. Every era produces its own people who feel compelled to act while everyone else hesitates. And that raises an unsettling possibility. Maybe the greatest burden of moral leadership is not opposition. Maybe it is knowing that your decision, however righteous it may be, could create suffering for yourself, for others, and for the very world you are trying to protect. If that is true, then Antigone's story is not really about rebellion at all. It is about a question that still haunts every society, every institution, and every individual who chooses principle over comfort. When duty creates consequences that no one can escape, how do we know whether the sacrifice was worth the price? If Antigone represents the burden of responsibility, then we have to ask a more difficult question: why was that burden hers to carry in the first place? Because responsibility does not emerge in a vacuum. It appears when two different visions of reality collide. And in Antigone's world, that collision takes the form of one of the oldest conflicts in human history. Order versus meaning. Most people assume these forces naturally work together. We want laws that are moral. We want authority that is wise. We want stability and justice to reinforce one another. But history tells a different story. Again and again, societies encounter moments when preserving order requires silence, while preserving meaning requires resistance. And that is where the real conflict begins. Notice something important. Antigone and Creon are often treated as opposites. Hero versus villain. Conscience versus power. Individual versus state. But that interpretation may be too simple. Because both figures are carrying responsibilities. One is trying to protect what she believes gives human life its dignity. The other is trying to protect what he believes prevents society from descending into chaos. That is the contradiction. If both sides believe they are serving a necessary duty, then the conflict is no longer about good people and bad people. It becomes a conflict between competing responsibilities. And suddenly the moral landscape becomes much more dangerous. Because once responsibility itself is divided, every decision creates a loss. Every choice protects one value while sacrificing another. This is why one of the most powerful memory fragments in the story is not a person, but a throne. A ruler seated upon it appears powerful. Yet from another perspective, that same throne becomes a burden. Every law issued from it carries consequences that cannot be fully predicted. Every attempt to preserve stability risks crushing something fragile but essential. The throne is not merely a symbol of authority. It is a symbol of responsibility under uncertainty. And uncertainty changes everything. We often imagine moral decisions as tests of character. We tell ourselves that if our principles are strong enough, the correct path will become obvious. But what if the opposite is true? What if the hardest moral decisions are difficult precisely because multiple values matter at the same time? That possibility transforms the entire meaning of duty. Duty is no longer a matter of certainty. It becomes a matter of choosing which burden you are willing to carry. And that choice leaves scars. Look closely at the people history remembers as moral leaders. Many were celebrated later, but isolated in their own time. Not because they lacked conviction. Because conviction forced them into conflicts where every available option carried a cost. That pattern extends far beyond ancient tragedy. It appears in courtrooms, boardrooms, governments, communities, and families. Every time someone chooses truth over harmony, justice over convenience, or principle over comfort, the same question returns. Not whether the choice is painful. It usually is. The deeper question is whether the pain serves a purpose larger than itself. This is where the burden begins to grow heavier. Because consequences rarely stop with the person who makes the decision. They ripple outward. Families are affected. Communities are affected. Institutions are affected. An act of conscience may inspire courage in one person and resentment in another. It may protect one value while destabilizing another. The consequences travel farther than the original intention ever could. And that leads us toward a disturbing revelation. Perhaps the greatest burden of responsibility is not making the choice. Perhaps it is accepting ownership of consequences that you never intended to create. If that is true, then we are approaching the deepest mystery hidden beneath Antigone's legacy. When two duties collide, and both demand sacrifice, how can anyone know which responsibility deserves to survive? What if the real danger is not choosing the wrong duty, but becoming so certain about a duty that you stop seeing its cost? That question pushes us into the most uncomfortable layer of this story. Because once two responsibilities collide, something unexpected happens. The conflict is no longer between people. It becomes a conflict between values. And values are far more difficult to negotiate than interests. Interests can compromise. Values often cannot. This is where the burden carried by figures like Antigone becomes more complex than simple courage. Courage suggests a clear enemy. Courage suggests a visible obstacle. But responsibility operates in a much darker landscape. Responsibility forces a person to act while uncertainty remains. And uncertainty creates a paradox. The stronger a person's moral conviction becomes, the greater the risk that they will overlook consequences hiding beyond their field of vision. Think about that carefully. We tend to assume that moral clarity protects people from making harmful decisions. Yet history repeatedly reveals the opposite pattern. Some of the most destructive outcomes have emerged not from people who believed in nothing, but from people who believed in something completely. That is the contradiction. Conviction creates strength. Conviction also creates blindness. The same force that allows someone to stand against pressure can also prevent them from recognizing the full complexity of reality. Suddenly the conflict expands beyond Antigone. It expands beyond Creon. It expands beyond ancient Greece itself. Now we are dealing with a recurring pattern in human civilization. Every era produces individuals who become convinced that they are protecting something sacred. Justice, freedom, order, tradition, progress. The specific value changes. The pattern remains. And once that pattern begins, another mystery emerges. Why do societies often split into opposing camps when both sides claim to be defending what is right? The answer may lie in a hidden truth about responsibility. Responsibility does not merely reveal character. Responsibility reveals priorities. It forces people to decide which value matters most when every available option carries a cost. This is where another memory fragment becomes important. A lone figure standing against an entire city. At first glance, it appears to symbolize courage. But look deeper. The image also symbolizes separation. The moment a person embraces a responsibility that others reject, they begin moving away from collective certainty and into personal risk. That isolation carries consequences long before any final outcome appears. Relationships become strained. Trust becomes fragile. Misunderstanding grows. And the individual gradually becomes trapped between two impossible fears. The fear of abandoning a principle. And the fear of what that principle might ultimately produce. This is the crisis hidden beneath moral leadership. Not weakness. Not cowardice. Responsibility itself. Because responsibility demands action before complete knowledge is available. No one receives a map. No one receives certainty. No one receives a guarantee that suffering will lead to something better. Yet decisions must still be made. And this realization forces us toward an even larger escalation. Perhaps the deepest conflict in Antigone is not between conscience and authority. Perhaps it is between intention and consequence. Human beings judge themselves by their intentions. History judges them by their consequences. Those two judgments rarely align perfectly. That gap creates some of the greatest tragedies ever recorded. A person may act from sincerity and still unleash suffering. A leader may pursue stability and still create injustice. A reformer may seek justice and still create disorder. The more closely we examine responsibility, the less simple morality becomes. And that leads us toward a revelation that changes the entire shape of the story. What if the true burden was never choosing between right and wrong? What if the true burden was discovering that two different forms of right can collide with one another, and that every choice made afterward leaves a wound somewhere? If that is true, then we have not yet reached the deepest layer of the mystery. Because there remains one question even more unsettling than everything we have explored so far. What if suffering is not merely the consequence of moral conviction? What if suffering is the price that every moral system eventually demands from those who believe in it most? What if the burden we have been examining is not actually about duty at all? What if duty is only the surface layer, and beneath it lies something far more fundamental? This is where the story begins to reveal its deepest architecture. Because the central figure is not merely carrying a responsibility. She is protecting a boundary. And throughout history, civilizations have depended on certain people to defend invisible boundaries that cannot be measured, counted, or enforced through power alone. The revelation is subtle but profound. Antigone does not represent obedience to a rule. She represents loyalty to meaning itself. That distinction changes everything. Rules can be replaced. Laws can be amended. Governments rise and fall. But meaning operates differently. Meaning determines what a society believes is sacred. Meaning determines which obligations survive when fear becomes stronger than conviction. Meaning determines whether human beings see themselves as members of a community or merely occupants of a system. Suddenly the conflict expands beyond responsibility and enters the realm of civilization. Because every civilization depends on an invisible agreement about what must never be abandoned. The moment that agreement disappears, something deeper than political order begins to erode. This is why one of the most powerful memory fragments is not a person, not a throne, and not even a decision. It is an empty space. A place where something essential should exist but does not. Human beings react strongly to absence. A missing photograph. An abandoned house. An empty chair at a family table. Sometimes absence communicates more powerfully than presence. And that is the symbolic force operating beneath the surface. The true crisis is not the existence of authority. The true crisis is the possibility that authority may become disconnected from meaning. Once that separation occurs, a society can remain organized while slowly losing its moral center. That is the deeper contradiction now emerging. We often assume that order protects civilization. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that order alone is insufficient. A perfectly organized system can still become spiritually hollow. A stable society can still lose sight of what gives life dignity. A functioning institution can still forget why it exists. This is where the role of Antigone becomes larger than the individual. She transforms into a warning signal. Not a warning against power. Not a warning against law. A warning against forgetting the values that law was originally created to serve. The consequence is enormous. Once a society begins protecting procedures more fiercely than principles, it creates a dangerous inversion. Means become more important than ends. Structure becomes more important than purpose. Stability becomes more important than truth. At first, the change appears small. Over time, it reshapes an entire culture. This is why the legacy of the story continues to resonate across centuries. It speaks to a recurring human temptation, the temptation to confuse legitimacy with morality. The temptation to assume that whatever preserves the system must automatically be right. Yet the deeper insight points in the opposite direction. Sometimes the survival of a society depends not on those who maintain the system, but on those who remind the system what it was built to protect. And here we encounter a revelation that changes the entire framework of the discussion. Perhaps the central question is not whether responsibility creates suffering. Perhaps the central question is whether suffering becomes inevitable whenever a civilization forgets the difference between order and meaning. If that possibility is true, then an even greater mystery emerges. What if the most important sacrifice was never made to challenge authority at all? What if it was made to preserve something that authority itself could never fully understand? If preserving meaning is more important than preserving comfort, then we arrive at the question hidden beneath every layer we have explored so far: what was Antigone actually protecting? Not a tradition. Not a ritual. Not even a specific obligation. The deepest revelation is that she was protecting a truth about human identity itself. This is the point that many readers overlook because they become focused on the conflict and miss the underlying philosophy. The central figure is not acting as a rebel against a ruler. She is functioning as a guardian of a boundary that separates human beings from mere systems. The distinction is subtle, but it changes the entire meaning of the story. Systems measure efficiency. Systems maintain order. Systems organize behavior. But systems alone cannot answer a deeper question. Why does a human life possess dignity in the first place? This is the core revelation. The burden carried by Antigone is not the burden of resistance. It is the burden of remembering. Remembering what cannot be reduced to utility. Remembering what cannot be justified through convenience. Remembering what remains valuable even when it becomes costly. Suddenly the image of the unburied body takes on a completely different meaning. It is no longer simply a symbol of neglected duty. It becomes a symbol of a civilization deciding whether people possess value because they are useful or because they are human. That distinction echoes far beyond the boundaries of ancient tragedy. Every society eventually confronts this question in a different form. Every institution eventually faces a moment when efficiency competes against dignity, when stability competes against conscience, when practical outcomes compete against moral meaning. And this is where the deepest contradiction finally reveals itself. Most people believe the greatest threat to morality is selfishness. Yet the story points toward something more dangerous. The greatest threat may be forgetfulness. Not forgetting facts. Forgetting values. Forgetting why certain principles exist. Forgetting the invisible foundations upon which trust, dignity, and community are built. Once those foundations disappear, people may continue following rules while gradually losing their connection to meaning. This realization transforms Antigone from a character into an archetype. She becomes the representative of every individual who chooses to preserve meaning when a culture begins drifting toward pure functionality. That role carries enormous consequences. Because the people who defend meaning rarely receive certainty as a reward. Instead, they inherit ambiguity. They inherit sacrifice. They inherit responsibility for outcomes they cannot fully control. This returns us to the burden that has been hiding in plain sight from the beginning. The burden is not suffering itself. Human beings have always endured suffering. The burden is accepting suffering without knowing whether the value being protected will ultimately survive. That is what makes the responsibility so heavy. A person may never witness the long-term impact of their choice. They may never know whether their sacrifice mattered. Yet they must decide anyway. This is why the legacy of Antigone remains alive across centuries. The story is not ultimately asking whether one person was correct. It is asking whether human civilization can preserve its deepest values without individuals willing to bear uncertainty on behalf of everyone else. The answer remains unresolved. But the implication is profound. If meaning survives only because certain people choose to protect it, then the true cost of responsibility cannot be measured by personal suffering alone. It must also be measured by what would be lost if no one accepted that burden. And that leads directly into the next and perhaps most unsettling consequence of all. What kind of world emerges when a society stops producing people willing to carry responsibilities whose value cannot be immediately proven? The consequences of a moral choice do not end when the choice is made. In many ways, that is where the real story begins. The decision itself occupies a moment. Its consequences can occupy generations. This is the legacy hidden beneath everything we have explored. Not the legacy of a single individual, but the legacy of a question that refuses to disappear. What remains after a society witnesses someone willing to bear uncertainty for the sake of meaning? The answer is more complicated than inspiration. We often imagine that acts of conviction leave behind clarity. Yet the most enduring moral acts rarely produce certainty. Instead, they leave behind tension. They force future generations to wrestle with the same dilemma from new angles. This is why the influence of Antigone does not reside in an answer. It resides in an unresolved challenge. Every era inherits the burden and must decide what to do with it. One of the strongest memory fragments is the image of a lone figure standing against an entire city. Over time, that image evolves. It ceases to belong to a single story. It becomes a recurring symbol in human consciousness. The journalist exposing uncomfortable truths. The reformer questioning accepted norms. The employee refusing to ignore wrongdoing. The citizen defending a principle that has become inconvenient. Different faces. Different contexts. The same burden. Yet there is a consequence that receives far less attention. The burden does not only transform the person who carries it. It transforms everyone who witnesses it. Once people observe someone acting according to a principle despite uncertainty, they can no longer pretend that moral responsibility belongs exclusively to someone else. A possibility enters the culture. A question enters the mind. What would I do? That question is often more disruptive than any action itself. Because it transfers responsibility from the story to the audience. This is where the scale expands beyond literature and enters psychology. Human beings are not shaped only by the values they follow. They are shaped by the examples they encounter. Certain figures become reference points. Not because they provide solutions, but because they expose hidden obligations. They remind people that comfort and meaning are not always aligned. The long-term consequence is profound. Entire cultures develop around the stories they choose to preserve. The stories become containers for values. They become repositories of unresolved wisdom. They become warnings against forgetfulness. Consider another memory fragment. An empty throne. Earlier, it symbolized the weight of authority. Now it represents something different. Succession. Continuity. The reality that every generation eventually inherits institutions it did not create and responsibilities it did not choose. The central dilemma returns in a new form. Will the next generation protect meaning, preserve order, balance both, or lose sight of why either matters? This is why the legacy extends far beyond the boundaries of one ancient tragedy. The story survives because the conflict survives. Human beings continue struggling to reconcile dignity with practicality, conscience with stability, ideals with consequences. No civilization has solved the tension permanently. Every civilization merely negotiates it again. And perhaps that is the deepest consequence of all. The burden never disappears. It changes hands. It moves from one generation to the next, from one institution to another, from one individual to someone who never expected to carry it. The question is not whether responsibility exists. The question is who will accept it when the cost becomes visible. And that leaves us with a final paradox that remains unresolved. If meaning survives only because people are willing to sacrifice for it, then how can any society distinguish between a necessary sacrifice and a tragic mistake before history delivers its verdict? Perhaps the lasting power of this story comes from a truth that is both simple and unsettling. Human beings do not live by certainty. They live by commitments made in the absence of certainty. That is why the questions raised here refuse to fade with time. The world changes. Governments change. Technologies change. Entire civilizations rise and fall. Yet the essential dilemma remains waiting for every generation. Not because people fail to learn from the past, but because there is no final formula for resolving the tension between meaning and consequence. In the end, the most important legacy is not a lesson. It is an awareness. An awareness that some of the responsibilities that shape history begin as invisible obligations that most people would rather avoid. An awareness that the values sustaining a culture often survive because someone chose to protect them before their importance could be proven. And an awareness that the cost of preserving meaning is rarely distributed equally. Some carry burdens that others never see. This is why the strongest memory fragments continue to resonate long after the details disappear. A lone figure standing apart from the crowd. An empty throne waiting for the next generation to inherit its responsibilities. An abandoned space where something essential should exist. These images endure because they are not confined to a single story. They belong to the human condition itself. Every person eventually encounters a moment when comfort and conviction begin moving in different directions. Every community encounters a moment when practicality and principle stop pointing toward the same destination. Every society encounters a moment when it must decide whether its deepest values are worth preserving when preservation becomes expensive. What makes these moments significant is not the outcome. It is the fact that no one can see the outcome clearly while living through them. Looking backward creates the illusion that history was obvious. Living forward reveals how uncertain everything actually is. This realization changes the way we understand courage. Courage is often imagined as fearlessness. But perhaps genuine courage has less to do with certainty than with responsibility. Perhaps it emerges when a person continues carrying a burden despite knowing that recognition may never come, validation may never arrive, and success may never be guaranteed. That possibility leads to a deeper reflection about human meaning itself. Maybe the most important values are not the ones that produce immediate results. Maybe they are the ones that quietly shape the moral landscape in which future generations will live. Their influence cannot always be measured. Their significance cannot always be calculated. Yet without them, something essential begins to disappear. Not all at once. Gradually. Silently. Almost invisibly. And that may be the final insight left behind by this story. The measure of a principle is not only what it achieves. The measure of a principle is also what vanishes when no one is willing to defend it. We spend much of our lives asking whether a sacrifice was justified, whether a burden was necessary, whether the cost was too high. Yet there may be another question that matters even more. A question that remains unanswered, perhaps because it can never be answered completely. If the values that give human life meaning can survive only through people willing to carry uncertain burdens, then how many of the things we cherish today exist because someone before us accepted a cost that history can no longer remember?